Shabbat Shalom. It may be hard to see because unfortunately the lights went out at the top yesterday, last night in fact, so we can't fix them yet. But what is this? No. You're all being very literal. You're telling me what the writing is on it. No, what is that actual structure? The Ark. Yes. All of you have suffered through the censorship of the Middle Ages. What is the official name for that piece of synagogue architecture? Aron HaKodesh. All right, everybody who's a regular has heard me say this for weeks, for years, for a very long time now. And I'm not saying it just because I like the word Kodesh. Right? It's a great word, means holy, very nice. But as I will tell a little tale, you may understand why it is even more important that we call it Aron HaKodesh rather than just the Aron. Why we call it the Holy Ark rather than just the Ark. So I had a question from one of my students just this last week who asked me why Judaism didn't promote itself more, why we weren't out there, why we weren't telling people the truth that Judaism has to tell to the world. And we talked about many different aspects, but one that I would like to focus on and share in greater detail with more of you is the issue of censorship. Not self-censorship per se, but the chilling effect of the legal censorship that was imposed upon Judaism for hundreds of years. Beginning around the 1500s, the European church organizations began to feel that, those Jews, they write things in their books that we don't like. They have some whole books that we don't like. The beginning in the 1500s, of course, was when they had the famous Talmud trials, and where the Talmud was taken and chucked into the flames in many parts of Europe. That's right, the Talmud, the greatest compilation of the debates and discussion, the free expression of our arguments over how best to fulfill God's commands through the Torah, was consigned to the flames because it was considered offensive. It was considered offensive to the Christian majorities who were in power at that time. Now, they didn't keep up with the burning, and thankfully enough copies survived that the Talmud was not completely wiped out of Europe, but they did decide that the Talmud needed to be censored if it was going to continue to be in those communities. That there were some passages that were so offensive and certain phrases that were considered so blasphemous that they had to be erased. Of course, any passage that happened to deal with the Jewish conception of Jesus, and in particular his conception, that was right out. Those were expunged from the Talmud throughout all of Europe, and it wasn't really until we reunited with our brothers and sisters from the Sephardic and Mizrahi communities that those holes in our Talmud were repaired, and the Talmud was restored with the original discussions of how Judaism felt about, their oppressors for 2,000 years. And you can imagine, it wasn't very flattering. But there were other phrases that the censors decided may not be explicitly insulting, but nonetheless, we think that it's meant to be insulting us. If we want to talk about thin skin, they had very, very thin skin and saw Jewish antagonism behind every phrase. For example, one of the most common topics that comes up throughout Judaism, as we've seen just last week with the issue of the golden calf, is avodah zarah, is the worship of something foreign. It is usually used as an expression against idolatry, but the Christian censors of the Middle Ages said, no. We know what they mean when they say avodah zarah, even though we had been saying it since before Christianity had begun. We know what they mean by it. They're talking about us. They are saying that Christianity is illegitimate, and how dare they? Don't they realize it's Judaism that's illegitimate? What kind of offensive nation would ever call our religion illegitimate when they're the ones that are illegitimate? We can see the hypocrisy, right? That's not going over your heads? Okay, it's important to recognize just how messed up this was. And so you may have heard, if you've done any modern study at all, a phrase that's often used to mean idolatry called akum. Now, if you haven't heard that word, that's okay. It's an abbreviation, it's an acronym, but it began to be used in much greater numbers after the censors got a hold of our books, because rather than having avodah zarah, which they had decided we were secretly plotting against their faith, akum means the worshipers of the stars and the star signs, the constellations. Right? We made it really, really explicit that we were not talking about Christians. Right? You guys don't worship stars, right? So when we talk about people worshiping idols, we're talking about the star worshipers. So please stop burning our books. Please stop taking heavy ink and wiping out our books. And likewise, other references that could have been possibly, if you squinted really hard, seen as a reference to Christians, were changed. So we got a lot more Samaritans in the Talmud. We got a lot more Kuthins in the Talmud. The Kuti were used as well as a substitute. The words that referred to Edom, which was in some communities often seen as a code for Europe and for Rome, and then the Roman Church, were also removed, expunged. Other euphemisms were put in place. But that wasn't sufficient. You see, just removing the insults, perceived or otherwise, towards Christianity was not sufficient for the censors of Europe, because Judaism still talked about itself like it was legit, like it had something to offer the world. It called its synagogues and its arks holy. Can you imagine the chutzpah, if they had used the word chutzpah in Rome? Can you imagine the temerity, the audacity of these people that have been crushed under the weight of oppression, brought out only because they rejected Jesus, and this was what their due punishment was? Can you imagine their temerity to dare to say that what they were doing was holy? And so indeed, in many, many books throughout Europe, those words were removed by the censors, struck through completely, because we were not holy. Our people had nothing good to say. We had nothing to offer the world. We were nothing more than an object example of what the rejection of Christianity could bring to you. Of course, that example was made by those who wished to make an example of us. It's not as though it was exactly a divine decree. And so Jews, well, we learned, keep your mouth shut. Don't draw attention to yourselves. Don't talk to other people about what we do. Don't tell other people what we believe. Just get to the marketplace, buy what you need, go home, work in your field, work in your trade, and if your non-Jewish neighbors are saying anything, smile, nod, and hope they don't report you. And if the censors decide to break down the door of the synagogue or the school and check the books, well, we'll make sure there's nothing in them that they'll find offensive. We will self-censor. We will remove anything that's too likely to get their ire. And then they'll put their stamp on it, approving it, and we'll be able to go on our not quite so merry way. Well, fast forward to the 20th century. And how many of us are still living under the censorship of the 16th century? How many Jews are still nervous in public? I know that everybody says they're more nervous now than they were before October 7th. I will grant you that, and I understand the material reasons for that. But were you exactly comfortable in your Jewish skin in public on October 6th? If someone was talking about their faith, their religion, saying that they had gone to church, would you pipe up if they didn't already know you were Jewish and say, oh yeah, I went to my synagogue yesterday. It was great. We blah, 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 the rabbi this. Or would you be afraid that, one, they'll now know you're Jewish, and two, they might start asking you stuff about Judaism. And while there's always that anxiety and fear that maybe I won't know how to answer their questions and that could be problematic, well, there's also the problem that if I do answer their questions honestly, eventually we're going to get to the point where we disagree. At some point, they're going to ask me why Jews do X, or why, when in their faith tradition, they don't, or why Jews don't accept certain truths that they hold as being self-evident and obvious. And then our neighbor becomes a stranger. They become the zara, if you will, the foreign element. Or at least we will be made to feel that way, we think. And so many Jews voluntarily ensure they don't ruffle any feathers, don't rock the boat, don't bring up anything, quietly sit and listen to other people talk about their religious activities, talk about their theology and their faith, and we keep our mouth shut, we keep our head down, we do what we need to, and we get on with life, and we hope we don't draw any attention to us because the censors are still there? Are we actually worried about a pogrom? Or has it simply become habituated? Have we simply adopted the rules of the oppressor as though they were our own? When other people ask me about why there are so few Jews, many of the answers are usually, well, the Jews don't proselytize. That's true. We don't proselytize. We don't go around knocking on doors and handing out pamphlets. We don't stand at bus stations and give people the lecture about the truth of Adonai. That is absolutely true, and for a good reason, because we don't believe everyone needs to be Jewish in order to have a relationship with God or to experience God's blessings. And if you don't believe they need to be Jewish, then you're not saving them from anything. But honestly, there's a big difference between not proselytizing and not even allowing people to know that you exist and what you believe. Fine, we're not going to knock down doors, we're not going to go corner people and try to convert them and explain to them the wrongness of their ways and how damned they are because they haven't chosen our path. Okay, definitely we're not doing that. But is there anything keeping you from just a frank expression of what you actually believe as a Jew? Of letting them know, well, I don't believe that there is such a thing as damnation in the classic sense of the word from Western civilization. I actually believe that God can't and thus doesn't have a body. And that is part of my foundational understanding of my relationship with the divine. Or just saying those words out loud, even in a synagogue, does that make you feel a little uncomfortable, wondering what the result would be, what the reaction would be? Are we nervous to be Jews? Are we censoring ourselves as Jews? We might be, to more or less degrees. Maybe together we don't censor ourselves too much, maybe. We still have a line missing from the Aleinu that was taken out by the censors. There are still other parts of our Siddur that bear the censor's mark that have not been properly restored. But in our conversations, can we at least be open? Can we at least avoid that self-censorship? Can we perhaps find the strength to recognize that what Judaism has to offer us is actually a worthwhile truth to share with others? Doesn't mean that we think other people should become Jewish immediately. Again, there's no demand within Judaism that others change who they are in their relationship with the divine, other than that their relationship be a good one, a just one, a kind and compassionate one. Are we afraid to speak those words? Are we afraid to share our wisdom, not as a proselytizer, but simply as someone who is proud of what Judaism has to offer, especially in the modern world? We should not be afraid. The world is in desperate need of the truths of Judaism. The censors tried to erase it from our heritage, and we fought to keep it there and put it back in when their power waned. And the world is better for that. And the world will be better still if we allow ourselves to speak openly and honestly. And if you discover that there are a few people around you who don't like what you have to say, good. That means they need to hear it. Because if it's still radical for them to imagine that someone believes differently, acts differently, lives differently, sees God differently, and that offends them still, then they are still living in the 16th century. Given the power, they would still erase our faith, our texts, our life. And they only refrain from doing so because they lack the will and they lack the power to do so. They should be made to feel uncomfortable, so that after they have felt uncomfortable, they can come to accept that not everyone is like them in perfect detail. And that maybe that strange person who does things a little differently has something to teach them, has an insight they have not yet heard, has perhaps just a little bit of a glimpse of the divine that they have not yet seen. And if we share that with each other, we will all benefit in basking in God's light. Shabbat Shalom.